Welcome to Public Forum, a community outreach program produced by North Idaho College located on Lake Coeur d'Alene. Featuring guests from around the globe addressing a wide variety of subjects, Public Forum serves to educate and enlighten. Please join host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart, in welcoming today's guests.
We are most pleased to bring you a two-part series, or a two-week series, on the life and writings of Thomas Paine. We came up with this idea when we were aware that there is a national organization called the Thomas Paine National Historical Association. We have 3 members of that board with us today and again next week to discuss the life and the works of this very interesting historical figure. First of all, I welcome to the program Robert Singletary. Robert Singletary is a former member of the faculty at North Idaho College. He continues to teach for a number of organizations and institutions, and he is a board member of the Thomas Paine National Historical Association. Robert, you've been on the program before, and we welcome you back. It's great to have you with us the next 2 weeks. And next to him is Ken Birchall, who is the vice president of the Thomas Paine National Historical Association. And Ken, it's great for you to take time, and it's one of the officers of this organization to be with us to discuss this very interesting man.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
And I'm equally pleased to welcome our third guest, who is Jeffrey Block. He is the treasurer of the national organization. And Jeffrey, it's a pleasure to have you here. And I know the 3 of you are going to be most interesting in your in-depth study of this interesting man named Thomas Paine. Welcome to the program, all.
My pleasure, too.
It's very pleasant on my part to welcome our regular panelists. First of all, Janelle Berg, who's an attorney in the state of Idaho. And next to her is Steve Schenck, who is the vice president of College Relations and Development at North Idaho College. And we shall invite Janelle to start today's questioning.
All 3 of you must be interested in history. Otherwise, you wouldn't be interested in being a member of the Thomas Paine Historical Society, the National Association. So tell me a little bit more about Thomas Paine. And let's start with you, Mr. Birchall, if you could. Share with us a little bit about Thomas Paine. Who was he, and why would we want to study him?
Well, Tom Paine was a great figure from the American Revolution period, the American Revolutionary period. He also participated in the English revolutionary activities at that time, as well as in the French Revolution. And most of the great figures from the American Revolutionary War period, Washington, Adams, Hamilton, and the rest of it, credited Paine's writing of Common Sense with really spurring the already bubbling and ferment of that period of time in the direction of independence. Prior to Paine's writings, people had been primarily thinking in terms of securing their rights as Englishmen. And the idea of separation and independence in a free republic hadn't really been bandied about much until Common Sense. And so we remember him first and foremost for that, but also for his participation in liberation movements around the world.
Robert Singletary, I know that Mr. Paine came from England. Can you tell us a little bit about his background in England and his training that led to his writing?
Sure. Tom Paine was born in a fairly small town, Thetford, in 1737. Quaker family. His father was by profession, a staymaker. I suppose most people would know that as a corset maker, has been used. Tom Paine went to grammar school, traditional English grammar school, until he was about 13, 14, and then followed pretty much in the steps of his father for a few years. And we don't really know a terrific amount about his early life until he came to America at the age of, I believe, 21 or so. Ken, you might could verify that. Upon the invitation of Benjamin Franklin. He was left the stay business, actually became a privateer. His family got him off one ship, and we know he did take another voyage. We don't know a lot about that. He certainly had some interesting experiences. He became an excise man for a while. And probably at that particular time, we have to remember the time of this man's life from the 1730s, late 1730s, up until 1809 when he died. This is really what we dubbed the Age of Enlightenment. And so I'm sure Thomas Paine probably had some contact with a lot of activities that were going on intellectually at that particular time, and certainly he became very much involved with his first real, I think, public awareness as a person who helped promote the excisemen were concerned about their pay, and he actually was a leader of actually going to Parliament. And in fact, that's where Franklin met him at that particular instance.
And once he came to the U.S., where did he live, Jeff? Or did he travel around the United States?
Yes, he moved around. He initially resided in Philadelphia when he first arrived. And then he moved about with the activities of the Revolution. I think he was in Bordentown, New Jersey. He was also in other parts of Pennsylvania during the Revolution as things were moving around. And eventually, I believe after the Revolution, came back to Philadelphia.
Steve Sheen.
It's interesting. I doubt that I'm atypical of most of our viewers. And when I say that, I mean that I knew Thomas Paine for the pamphlet Common Sense Only, and knew very little about that pamphlet. And yet, in some very quick research before the show, it seems like he was kind of a fascinating character. And there's some things here that seem particularly interesting to me. Now, my research, Robert, suggests, and I don't know that this is authoritative at all, that he came to America just before the Revolution at age 37. Mm-hmm. 2 years before the Revolution. How in the world was he viewed in England, I wonder? He's only an American for 2 years, only a colonist for 2 years, and he's arguing for secession. And it seems to me that I read later on that he was either banned or outlawed in England in later
That's
life.
correct. His book, The Rights of Man, was outlawed.
Was he viewed... I've also read that he was a rather difficult personality, a person who had few friends. Can you comment on that at all?
Well, Paine, when he came to the United States, there's always been a bit of a mystery about what happened prior to that. We know that he wrote the pamphlet that Robert referred to, the Case of the Officers of the Excise. We also know that he associated with a circle of people at that period of time that were very much part of the Enlightenment movement in England. He attended lectures at the Royal Society. Mm-hmm. He was a member of a group of people that included the mathematics tutor to the king. Ferguson, the early pioneering astronomer, was a personal friend of his. Watson, who was a popular lecturer at that time. So we know he spent a lot of time involved in English politics. There have even been assertions let me restate that and say there are some who believe that Paine was the pamphleteer Junius in England. In either case, with his activities there with the Royal Society and the rest of it and with those men, we know that he was very involved in English politics. So he didn't just come, straight out of an obscure background and become the greatest writer of the period, or arguably the greatest writer of the period. And some of the most interesting historic research that's going on right now is, in fact, on that period, just prior to when Paine came to the United States.
Also, in addition to that, Steve, when he first came to the United States, he very quickly became publisher of a magazine called Pennsylvania Magazine. And there's still a lot of debate right now because he wrote under a lot of names, pseudonyms, and he wrote one of his earliest pamphlets was against slavery and slave trade. And some of his early pamphlets in favor of women's rights. And so he was very much in the thick, on the cutting edge of the movements that were going on at that particular time for the rights of the man's rights. In particular, Paine, interesting, one of the things I think that's important about Paine is that Paine democratized democracy. By that I mean there were Democrats who were English and French aristocrats. There were Democrats, people leading in that direction, who were the philosophes, and a few of the ministers, some of the more liberal ministers were leaning in that direction. But Tom Paine brought it down, particularly as Ken mentioned, with his use of the common English language, brought it down to the average person on the street, the average working man.
Let me try to back up, if I may, Tony, for just a minute, because there are some terms you both have used, that I'm going to ask Jeff to explain to us. Tom Paine was a writer, a corset maker, and an exciseman. What in the world?
Exciseman was a collector of tax.
All right. So he worked for the government.
He worked for the government and traveled around the country collecting revenue.
Let me ask another background question that confused me a little bit. His father was not a wealthy man, was a corset maker. I'm surprised to hear that Tom Paine was educated from an early age to about the age of 13. Would that have been unusual in England to receive that much public education if you were not a wealthy person?
Probably in the Quaker society, education would have been stressed and encouraged, but he was from a modest family that probably did not have the resources to send him on for further education.
So that may have been an explanation for the amount of education he received. And if Tony will allow me to ask one more question, it gets back to some of these inconsistencies. Here's an Englishman who comes to America and within 2 years is arguing for a Declaration of Independence. Would you talk just a little bit about his religious beliefs? Because he was brought up a Quaker, and yet some thought he was an atheist. In fact, I believe he was not. Can you explain a little bit more about that?
Well, certainly. With regard to his religion, he definitely believed in the concept of a God or a supreme being. There's no question on that if you read his introduction to the Age of Reason. It's quite a testimony to his faith. Whether he was religious in the Christian sense of the modern word, definitely not. But he was a firm believer, as many of the intellectuals of that time were, in the belief system of deism.
So I guess my point from that line of questioning, and I'll quit after I say this, is that he was very definitely an original thinker.
I would say so.
Thank you.
Very good question. There's got to be a rather long list of reasons why you admire Thomas Paine. How many famous people have a National Historical Association for them? So I want to get to the root of this organization. What is it about Thomas Paine that's not true of Thomas Jefferson or whomever we might want to talk about, Rousseau or Aristotle, whomever it might be, that you'd create a national organization? You must have some very basic reasons. And in answering the other questions, you've been very enlightening about some of the points. But maybe I'll start with you, Robert. And you've talked about his pamphlet, Common Sense. You've talked about the rights of man and the Age of Reason. And I'm going to ask all three of you to participate in my question, and that is, go to the heart of his philosophy. And if you could just list for me some of the, for his time, revolutionary ideas he had that made him so different and unique in many ways.
Well, I think I've made reference to one already. And that Thomas Paine brought the concept of democracy to the common man, to the common working man, which was very unheard of at that time.
They just weren't introduced to it.
Absolutely.
Either in written form or even in speeches.
Absolutely. And he spoke and wrote in a language, clear, precise language, that the common man could understand. I think that's the reason why Common Sense was so well read. And it was not only read by the aristocrats and the educated at a particular time, it was read by the common foot soldier. And so was his crisis papers and others, which he wrote during the Revolution.
So are you saying, Robert, that without his writings that the evolution of democracy would have been slower and longer in coming?
I think so. And as a matter of fact, I'm not sure the revolution itself would have occurred, because I think Common Sense, as has been mentioned already, brought that idea of independence, of American. I think it may very well be that he may have been the first to actually use the word United States of America.
He was.
You know, that's that's pretty important. That's a pretty important concept. And it wasn't just an America that he saw of the wealthy, the privileged. He fought every aspect of tyranny, regardless if it came from political tyranny, from the church, from slave trade, from you name it. He was very much in favor, and I would say the common thing was Thomas Paine was for the rights of the common man.
Kim, would you add to that by indicating some of the other, Robert's done a really excellent job of explaining something very major, but what were some of the other components of that democracy that he saw as he reached out to the common person?
Well, for me, Paine was the idealist's idealist. He was the paradigm all the way down the line. The list of firsts for this man are extraordinary. The essay that Robert referred to, African Slavery in America, which was published before Common Sense, is the first formal published essay advocating freedom of the slaves in the United States. He was one of the earliest advocates for rights of women as well. He wrote Common Sense, and incidentally, to underline again something that Robert was saying, that as recently as a month before the Revolution, Washington was quoted as saying that in no way did he favor the idea of separation, and that if anyone accused him of having done so, that he would call them out for being a scoundrel and a blackguard and the rest of it. And almost all of the founders, even those that later opposed Paine, like Adams and Hamilton, fully credited him with sparking the idea of independence and revolution in that sense of the word. He then went from the United States before the revolution was even done here and went to England and wrote what many political scientists consider to be the preeminent work of political science, The Rights of Man, for which, as you pointed out, he was outlawed. And then on to France, where he personally wrote the French Constitution with Condorcet. He's a man of immense, huge accomplishments. He was an idealist also in the sense that he never received a penny for anything he did. He donated all of the publication rights to Common Sense to buying mittens for the troops, who were in fact freezing in Valley Forge at that time. And he died not destitute by any means. He was awarded some property at the end of the war, and so he had some assets. But this is a guy who took everything that he accomplished and gave and gave and gave back. And I think it's part of that real idealistic, revolutionary stance that I find most appealing about Tom Paine, above and beyond any other person of that period.
Jeffrey, from your colleagues here, it's really clear that they are saying that he was ahead of his time, that George Washington was slower in actually promoting separation. Even the history of Abraham Lincoln, who was often listed as our greatest president, that's debatable, but he certainly was a great, great president. Even he gradually came to the conclusion that we could not remain half slave and half free. He didn't start out as a young man with that clear definition. So would you add to this that when you're talking about slavery and women's rights in this country, even the right to vote didn't come until 1920, and he died in 1809, was he ahead of his time with all of these leaders, and his writings maybe encouraged them to move in that direction?
Oh, absolutely. Actually, Abraham Lincoln was an admirer of Thomas Paine. Mm-hmm. But regarding his writings, he wrote in what was called the vernacular of the masses, in a means and a style that was different than others at that time. Jefferson in particular, you'll read, he'll go on and on with long sentences with commas and commas and commas. Paine's sentences were brief, concise, to the point that everyone could understand them. You didn't need a large education to comprehend what he was writing about. He touched on a concept that was unique at that time, and that was monarchy. What right did monarchy have to exist in the first place? And that was the truly revolutionary sense of the word, because at that time the world was governed by the British Empire, by the king. And Paine outlined in very easy terms that anyone can understand that monarchy has no basis to exist. And interesting. I'm sorry, Jim. And that the rights of individuals exist within themselves, and it's not coming down from the king.
It's rather interesting that one of the greatest authoritarian figures of that particular time and somewhat later, Napoleon, met Paine and said to Paine, there should be a statue erected to you in every city in the world. Universe. Thank you.
Really, yeah. Janelle Bird.
Well, this is very interesting. What is the purpose of your organization? What do you hope to accomplish? Do you want to get more people acquainted with Paine's writings and his ideas? Is that the purpose of the organization? Let's start maybe with Jeff, since you're a treasurer. Is that the purpose of the organization?
Well, as we've been alluding to, Paine was marginalized, or has been marginalized through history. Many of us who have gone through the American educational system will only understand a little bit of him, probably just common sense. So for many other reasons, he was marginalized, as I've said before, through history. And it's our goal to educate the world on the life, times, and writings of Thomas Paine.
Now, my understanding, Ken, is that even though he was writing, he had to distribute some way. And so how did he get the word out to people? How did he manage to encourage so many people in his lifetime?
Well, there were means of publication and distribution during that period of time. And in fact, an early publisher that he picked in the United States, Robert Bell and Aitken, another, were both very well known and very widely supported publishers. Some works were done by subscription, where people would actually pre-subscribe a work to be published. But generally, his went by word of mouth and by newspaper, and had extraordinary sales. Common Sense was the largest selling book of its time. It was the largest selling book in history at its time. Echoing John Lennon's comments in our time, it outsold the Bible in Paine's time. Something like 250,000 copies in the first 3 months of publication in the United States, and 500,000 worldwide in the first 3 years of publication was a phenomenal run. Let me mention one other thing too, Janelle. Our association is actually the oldest chartered National Historical Association in the country. We were formally founded in about 1895, but you can actually trace our roots much earlier, clear back to the 1840s with the original erection of the Paine Monument in New Rochelle.
And so, Robert, is the idea to acquaint people with his ideas. Do you distribute materials now?
We do, and we have a website which very shortly, within the next month, I would say that all the works of Thomas Paine you'll be able to get them off our website. We also have a variety of educational programs which we sponsor. The museum, which is a museum in New Rochelle, New York, has a tremendous educational programs for that area. So there's an awful lot that we're doing out there as Jeff said, we want to educate the world about the lifetimes and works of Thomas Paine. And I think underlying that, to pinpoint one more, is that Paine was not only just marginal in terms of his what we know about him. There was years there where there was distinct, on-purpose character assassination for Tom Paine, and we want to correct that. There is some very bad things said about Thomas Paine. And,
get into those in the next show. I get the viewers back next week. Steve Sheen.
Apparently, Thomas Paine didn't just argue for separation from England; he fought for it. Can any of you tell me a little bit about his role in the Army of the Revolution?
I certainly can. Paine went from writing Common Sense. One of the first things he did was go and enlist in the Continental Army. He served first in Robideau's flying camp, which is credited today with being one of the early, what do you call it when you have a special forces group that moves from place to place and fills in the gaps, and then went and served under Nathaniel Greene as General Nathaniel Greene's aide-de-camp. And so this was a guy that put his musket where his mouth was, so to speak.
And I suspect Tony wants to save some of this for our next show, but he actually didn't stay in America and the colonies for long after the war.
That's correct.
What convinced him to leave so quickly?
After the Revolution, he began to pursue scientific endeavors.
Mm-hmm.
Namely, he came up with another revolutionary concept, and that was a single-span bridge to cross, was it the Delaware River?
Originally, I think it was.
Delaware River, and the idea was to avoid the ice jams that would come down the river in the wintertime, which was typical of having a center pier in the river. So his idea was to span completely across the river, eliminate the threat of ice and what have you. So to take his concept, to develop his concept, he had to take it back to England, back to France to get the endorsement from the French Academy of Sciences and from the Royal Society. So that was, I believe it was sort of a personal tangent that he went off on, and certainly circumstances came up that, again, detoured him off of his scientific endeavors and went into his participation, as Ken mentioned, in other revolutions.
And if my very brief research is correct, he also proposed using rather, at the time, revolutionary building material for that bridge.
That was the cast iron.
Right.
And the beauty of how he came up with that concept was he observed a spider building a web. And he figured that if that's the way nature intended a spider to build a web, there must be some sense of efficiency in that design. So his inspiration, again, did not come from a formal educational background. It came from observing nature.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, Jeff, because we talked earlier about his Quaker upbringing, and that may have contributed to an education that many young men at that era in England wouldn't have received, and yet his formal education was pretty brief. Where did all the ideas come from? Was he largely self-taught?
Well, there again, going back before he came to the United States, you have to really focus on that period where he was associated in the circle that made up the Royal Society, and that Watson, the famous lecturer, Paine talks about in his writings at that period of time being so inspired and so interested in what he was reading and learning that he went out and purchased a set of globes. And in that day, every educated individual had a set of globes, one terrestrial and one celestial. So you had a map of the earth and a map of the sky, so that you could understand, the world as it is, not as a flat earth, but as a round planet, revolving around the sun in the enlightened sense. So we know that Paine, did a lot of study back at that period of time. We do not have near the documentation for that we do after the writing of Common Sense, where we really have a lot of information about Paine. But of course that makes it real fertile ground for research, and we have some people out there working in that area.
This, just to add to what Jeff said about his scientific adventures, he was very heavily involved in the development of the early steamboats prior to Fulton.
A true Renaissance man.
True Renaissance man. True man of the Enlightenment.
And the bridge was another one of his firsts. Mm-hmm. It was, in fact, the first single design for a single-span iron bridge.
Well, you certainly built the bridge for my question. The next show, my next question dealt with Robert and the Renaissance. I know how much Robert enjoys that. So to all three of you, thank you for so much being on our program. On behalf of the panel and our staff, we thank you so much. And the great news for our viewers is that our three guests will be back next week to talk about the life and writings of Thomas Paine. We just got started on the first program, and some of the issues we'll pursue next week have to do with was Thomas Paine a Renaissance man? We want to talk about natural law and some of his views of institutions and his critiquing of those institutions, and he as a political leader. And I'd like to compare him as a political leader with political leaders today in relation to the Renaissance question. Until then, thank you for being with us. We'll see you next week. And ladies and gentlemen, I hope you'll be with us, and we will continue the discussion of the writings of Thomas Paine next week. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
Recorded on the campus of North Idaho College, Public Forum is the longest-running entirely college-produced program on PBS. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us again at this same time next week for another edition of Public Forum on this public television station. Welcome to Public Forum, a community outreach program produced by North Idaho College located on Lake Coeur d'Alene. Featuring guests from around the globe addressing a wide variety of subjects, Public Forum serves to educate and enlighten. Please join host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart, in welcoming today's guest.
We are most pleased to continue our discussion from last week on the topic, the life and writings of Thomas Paine. It was just a thrill for us to have our three guests last week, and they're all back again this week. And we just got started, gentlemen, on the works and influence of Thomas Paine. I welcome back to the program Robert Singletary, who's a board member of the Thomas Paine National Historical Association. And next to him is Ken Birchall, who is the vice president of that association. And next to him is Jeffrey Block, who is the treasurer. Gentlemen, I just had a tremendous time, and I know Steve Shink joins me in saying that from last week. And let's get right into the program, and I welcome back Steve Shink, our panelist, who's the vice president of college relations and development at North Idaho College. And Steve, why don't you start for us?
Tony, thank you very much. And I certainly learned a lot during last week's show, and I thought I might begin by asking one of you, perhaps Ken, because I think you covered a number of firsts that ought to be credited to Thomas Paine in the last show. Maybe just give us a brief highlight of this remarkable person so we can use that as a foundation for some further questions.
That's right, Steve. He was a tremendous individual. Just amazing, some of the things that he did. Credited with writing the first formal writing that advocated manumission or freedom of the slaves in the United States. That was his essay, African Slavery in America. We have a copy of that on our website, incidentally. Designed the first single-span iron bridge on the engineering side. Wrote Common Sense, which is credited with having sparked our revolution. All of the major leaders at that time, Washington, Adams, Hamilton, all said, without common sense, there would have been no revolution. No one was unified. Went to England, wrote one of the preeminent texts in political science, still to this day, The Rights of Man. The Crisis Papers, backing up a little bit in the Revolutionary War, credited with holding the cause together. These are the times that try men's souls, the famous first line. Eloquent writer. After Britain went to France, took part in the French Revolution, wrote the French Constitution with Condorcet, and there published his last major work, which was The Age of Reason. But this is an individual that wrote literally, tens, if not hundreds of other famous letters and essays on government, social standing. He was one of the earliest advocates of women's rights as well. The list just goes on and on.
A remarkable career.
Amazing.
Robert or Jeff, anything else you'd like to add to that sort of summary of our topic?
I think, again, another first that we covered in the last time that should not be overlooked. He was really the first major figure to write where the common, ordinary working man could understand it.
Excellent. Jeff, anything you want to add?
I just reinforce that he encouraged the concept of abolishing monarchy, which was, again, a revolutionary concept of its time. I mean, republicanism and democratic government was only in theory, and he put that in practice by specifically outlining why monarchy should be abolished.
Thank you all. I thought I'd jump back across the Atlantic Ocean. He came to America at about the age of 37, just before the Revolution, and left shortly after the Revolution to go to France, where I have to believe he further irritated his English forebears because of his stance regarding the French Revolution. I wonder if you might pick up a little bit. We know, Ken, from you that he helped write the Constitution, but he was actually, I believe, elected to a government position. Didn't even speak French. Elected to government in France. Could you tell us a little bit about, the three of you, about his years in France?
That's right. He was received as a hero when he went to France. He was literally carried ashore off the ship, and he was elected to the French Convention from 4 different departments. He accepted Calais and went and sat in the French Convention. But you have to understand that, the French Revolution was something that deteriorated into mobocracy at one point, the famous French Terror. And by the time that had happened, Paine had also seen most of his close friends hauled off and guillotined. He himself spent, I think, was it 16 months or something like that in a dungeon in France at that time, when Robespierre finally perceived him as being an enemy of what had become the revolution. And Paine himself was very disappointed in what happened in France, but he never lost sight of his small r Republican ideals and his democratic ideals. He remained true to those to the very end. He just simply affirmed that the French Revolution got disoriented.
In fact, it's rather interesting to add to that. I'm sorry, Jeff. That one of the things that got him into trouble with Robespierre was, of course, he really did not want to execute King of France, King Louis. Mm-hmm. And that was one of the very first divisions between he and Robespierre's followers.
For the audience's benefit, and I will learn too, I'm sure. Tell us a little bit about, would you put Robespierre into context for us, please?
Well,
it's a name not everyone's going to be familiar with.
As you well know, when the French Revolution began, there were various factions about how this was to be brought about. And as Ken mentioned, Robespierre, of course, once one group got in control, another party would oppose that. And of course, Robespierre was one of the leaders of a party that was we all know about the Reign of Terror. This was the man who really put to the guillotine many famous people that were actually the originators of the concept of a revolution in France.
Of course, what was his eventual fate?
Well, the same thing, by another group. Yeah. So there was tremendous amount of deception, distrust about how this revolution was to proceed and what its eventual goals would be and how it would be carried out.
The character of Tom Paine, though, is highlighted, as Robert said. He wanted to abolish the monarchy, not the monarch, and actually favored exiling him to the United States.
Yeah,
at the time.
Paine said that the revolution would have been better served if they'd sent King Louis back to the United States, where he'd learned the rights of a free citizen and how a man ought to live in the world.
And Tony, maybe I can build a little bit of a bridge back to the United States. Actually, isn't there some belief that Paine ended up in prison because of the efforts of the what would he be called, the ambassador to France from the United States?
Oh, absolutely. Gouverneur Morris was an arch enemy of Paine, a dyed-in-the-wool Federalist. And of course, we have to remember the context of what's going on here, because even after the American Revolution, there was a reaction, again, sort of a counter-revolution that went almost backwards in terms of what Paine really felt should happen in terms of revolution.
But just to fill that in, I guess Paine was marked for prison in France because he was English, claimed U.S. citizenship, and then was denied by...
That's right. Gouverneur Morris denied him being an American citizen at that particular time. And of course, he was in prison, almost by accident, I think, escaped the guillotine. And one of the sad things about it is that America, and particularly Washington at that particular time, it was Washington administration, refused to. It was very easy. He could have been released from prison under Washington's.
Can I follow one quick question? Do you then disagree with the idea that Jefferson actually consented to allowing Paine to stay in prison because Morris convinced him? Was it Washington? That it would be the safest place for him at that time in France? You don't accept that? You think Morris was just an enemy and nothing more?
I can speak to that.
Go ahead.
There's no actual documentation that Washington conspired in that. We have some letters from Gouverneur Morris reporting back to Washington, D.C. It seems reasonable to assume that President Washington was aware, but we have no actual documentation to say that he made any instructions to that effect.
Thank you.
Great question. The struggle is between talking about his life and excitement and his ideas, and so we're back and forth between those, which is appropriate. But I want to talk a little more about his philosophy. And my basic question is, when you talk about his writings and his views on rights of women and ending slavery, and he belonged to an abolitionist movement, as he introduced what today we would call participatory democracy, was he a believer in natural law? You've mentioned already that he said that it's within you that the rights are there. And certainly a lot of philosophers and great political writers have talked a lot about natural law. Did he believe in natural law?
I personally think he did. And if you go back to the time that the Enlightenment period, this was a concept that was embraced by pretty much all of the thinkers and philosophers of the Enlightenment, that through reason that man could comprehend natural law. And these rights that Paine was talking about was not something that human beings decide one way or the other. This is natural, that human beings...
It comes at birth.
Absolutely.
There's no question about that. If you read in Paine's Age of Reason, he says that if you want to understand the mind of the Creator, you simply read the one work that the Creator left for us most eloquently, which is the creation. It's to look at nature. If you want to understand the mind of God, you have to look at nature, is what Paine said.
Jeff, in relation to that, certainly the institutions of his time were anti-democratic, basically, certainly in England and France until the revolutions came about. He was a great critic of the institutions and their control, was he not?
Oh, absolutely.
He saw that as a roadblock to like his work, like the rights of man or common sense.
Yes, the institutions being the established government, the concept of the monarch, basically that the monarch, again, as I said before, doesn't has no right to exist, and therefore those rights belong to the people. And the concept of a representative government he was in favor of.
Would that not explain his revolutionary support that in his time he saw that only revolution could change those institutions? Ken?
Well, I think that's true, because they were so well entrenched and so all-powerful. Not because Paine wouldn't have chosen another route, because he clearly says in his writings that he favored peaceful discourse, rational discourse, always whenever possible. But the simple fact of the matter is that monarchy and aristocracy were not going to relinquish power without a fight. The fight was really caused by them, not by the people that wanted to exercise their natural rights.
And then one final question back to Steve for his series of questions. But on the last show, Robert, you indicated that he was maligned, and I know from where you're coming from, the association, that was unjustified. And I believe I'm correct to say that greatest criticism of him came from his work, The Age of Reason. And today, as we sit here, the philosophy on the right is, I guess we can put in two categories. Mm-hmm. Those philosophical on the right for religious purposes still have a very negative outlook on Thomas Paine, but those on the right that are not basing it on religion but other philosophical reasons are beginning to admire him. Can you explain to us, can you, as a board member of the association, defend Thomas Paine against those criticisms? Number one, tell us what they are, and then why you think they're in error.
Well, going back to an earlier statement that I had made about some of the things that Thomas Paine was the heart of his belief was that tyranny, no matter where it appeared, should be abolished.
So he criticized it in the church,
he criticized
or organized
absolutely,
religion, and in government.
Absolutely.
In
society, wherever it could be found.
Any institution that hindered the democratic process.
Where common man was being controlled by someone, no matter where the authority came from. And I think it was under that banner that Paine started criticizing the church, because he looked at the history of the church, and I don't think it would take any great educated person, if you know a little about the history of Western society, particularly since the fall of the Roman Empire, that the church was one of the major authoritative controlling elements of Western society.
Give us an example.
Both Catholic and eventually Protestant.
Excuse me if I interrupted him a long time, but under the Age of Reason, give us a quote from him that got him in trouble about what he said about organized religion.
Well, I basically think what he talked about when he felt that a lot of organized religions were created by man, and they were based largely on myth and untruth. And being a man of reason, a man of the Enlightenment, he felt that should be corrected.
A real simple one.
Yeah.
A real simple one for you, Tony, is he just simply said, I do not believe in the Christian church and the Muslim church or the Jewish church or any other church that I know of. My mind is my own church, is what Thomas Paine said, and that angered an awful lot of people. I'm glad we kind of hit on this spot, because it needs to be touched on, at least briefly anyway. Partly as a result of that book, we had about 100 years in this country of vilification and attacks against Paine. There were actually two paid-for yellow journalistic attacks against Paine. The first one was Sir Francis Oldys in England, and then later James Cheetham. Both wrote attack biographies against Paine. And in those biographies, he was characterized as being a filthy, besotted, drunken, foul-mouthed infidel, basically, just the lowest scum of the earth. And to this day, we still find people, usually through ignorance, quoting from those works, which were paid for by the British government, basically, to go out and to tear down his reputation, much in the same way that attacks are made on people's reputation this day, rather than attacking the ideas that they represent.
Let me add one thing to that, and it was not just Thomas Paine that had these ideas, because if you go back to Voltaire and some of the writers and the philosophers of the Enlightenment and the whole deist movement, many of our founding fathers were not Christians in the traditional sense of the word. They were deists and believed very much the way Paine did. So I think, and there was a tremendous reaction against that. There was a tremendous reaction. We add that to the Federalist reaction and to the reaction against the whole, there was a reaction against the entire Enlightenment movement.
One final thing, and I've got to go back with Steve. I know the series of questions, and fortunately we have time, quite a bit of time, but in relation to that, Jeffrey, one other thing on this point, because it's really something that's got a lot of attention in the past in this country. When we hear charges that he was an atheist, that he didn't believe in a God, I hear your association saying that is not his position. Correct me if I'm wrong, but was he was criticizing institutions that he thought were controlling, but that one spiritualism all came from within, just like he had in other issues. That is right. I hear you saying that Thomas Paine thinks that, like under natural law, whatever it may be, that all comes from you in deciding whether it be political or religious or philosophical. Is that a correct observation?
Well, he certainly believed in the concept of the supreme being. That's undeniable. The allegations of being an atheist just cannot be justified or proven. Age of Reason, he clearly outlines, as Ken quoted, his faith, his testimony of his faith. It just so happened that he dared to think out of the box, dared to question the Bible, and therefore he was slandered and vilified, etc., etc. But by no means was he an atheist. He was definitely a very spiritual man.
Steve,
from the time he was a young boy till his last will.
His Quaker upbringing would have influenced.
Extremely moral man.
Okay, Steve Sheen.
What if questions are not fair, and I know that, but you three have dedicated a lot of time and energy to studying this man and his life, and I'm just intrigued by the notion that he held office in France. He's an Englishman who maybe started the American Revolution and is elected. His only elective office is in France. Is later imprisoned in France, and there writes, or at least starts to write, The Age of Reason, which is probably the biggest reason that by the time he returned to the United States in the 1790s, I think, that he had few friends left. Had he not done that, had he stayed in America beyond the Revolution, could he have been elected to office right after the Revolution? Could he have changed his image in this country, and would he be remembered differently?
He served in different capacities during the Revolution. He was Secretary of Foreign Affairs, which would be the closest thing we have to a Secretary of State in this day and age. So he did hold various political offices. He was a clerk in the Pennsylvania Assembly or the legislature. And
another appointed office?
Mm-hmm. Correct.
Another appointed, yes. Whether he could have run for political office in the modern sense of the word, I don't suspect he was that type of individual that would do the politicking in the sense that we know it today.
Let me follow up on that for just a second. We covered it at length in last week's show, but Common Sense was at the time a hugely successful written publication. It's, by some estimates, maybe as many as 1/5 of all American colonists bought copies of that publication. I mean, to do that in the United States today, you'd have to sell 70 million copies of something in a relatively short period of time. At the end of the Revolution, was he a popular figure in America, or was that popularity already starting to erode?
He was a popular figure in America. He was a popular figure in France. He was a hero to the French.
No one stood taller at that time than Paine.
Yeah, he was one of the 3 or 4 men of the time who were, believed to characterize the age. Ben Franklin was one such, and so was the famous scientist and medical figure Priestley, and Paine was the other one. When he left the United States, he was probably the most popular and most well-known person, other than possibly George Washington, in the country. And I think you're right, Steve. If he'd have wanted to, I think at that point he could have easily been elected to office. When he came back in 1802 from France, the whole situation had changed, and I think it would have been a heck of a hard deal for him to have been elected to anything.
Now, we didn't talk about this last week, haven't talked about it yet this week, but if The Age of Reason had that dramatic an impact on his popularity in America, I have to assume it was also a very popular publication. widely disseminated. Is that true?
It was widely published, and we have to try to go back and see this in as realistic terms as we can. It was a contest, and it was a contest that split the country and to some extent split the world. You might even liken it a little bit to the current election in that sense, pretty much right down the middle. And the United States swung. Robert called it a counter-revolution, or maybe it was Tony, I think that's exactly the right term, back to the right, back conservatively, back closer to the Tory, to the monarchist view of government through the Washington and Adams administrations. And Jefferson's election, you'll remember if you think back, really was the reaction back the other way. People had had enough of the Alien and Sedition Acts and those kinds of oppressive governmental acts to where they said, heck, we've got to get back to the ideals of the Revolution. Jefferson was the last main figure that was represented that small r republicanism, and so he was elected as the third president.
So the rights of man drove the final nail in Paine's coffin in England because they hated that defense of the French Revolution. They were threatened by the loss of monarchy, of course. The Age of Reason really undermined Paine in the United States. Did he come back in the 1790s with any major allies? And I think Adams was a significant foe. Is that correct? A major Federalist who.
Well, Jefferson welcomed him into the White House, and that created a huge scandal. Jefferson was his most notable friend, and he remained true to Paine through that period of time. So yes, he did have allies when he went back. But I want to put a fine point on something. The Age of Reason was used to attack Paine for his religious views, unquestionably. But I think that it's fair to say the reason it was used was because of his Republican ideas. And here in the United States, the Federalist groups...
Could you, especially today, Republican and Democrat have different connotations. Could you explain that to...
Well, we mean, at that period of time, a Republican, small r, I always make the distinction.
Not the political party.
Not the political party. A Republican was a person who believed in representative government, basically. He believed that governmental power derived from the citizenry, from the bottom up, not from the top down, and through representative action, representative democracy. The Federalists at that period of time believed strongly in very strong centralized federal government. Some of them, it is said that Adams and Hamilton, for example, there's a case can be drawn that they were both monarchists. We have copies of their writings where they advocate a monarchy. So they were certainly, to say the least, in favor of a strong centralized government. And Paine was attacked, I think, because of his Republican views, and his religious views were used as a stick to beat him with. Do you follow me?
I see. So he came back in pretty turbulent times.
Very turbulent times. It was the Second American Revolution. It's a fascinating period of time.
Thank you very much.
So you are really saying also that Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson were very close in philosophy.
Very much.
And
Lots of correspondence between the two.
there was.
Monroe was also an advocate of Paine. In fact, it was Monroe that really got him out of prison, released him from prison, rescued him from prison, was responsible for buying him a piece of property in New Rochelle, New York.
Well, actually, that was awarded to Paine by the New York State Legislature.
Right.
So with the election of Thomas Jefferson and the anti-Federalists throwing the Federalists out of office was a good message for Thomas Paine to come back to the United States. It was a much more friendly, at least governmental policies.
Yeah, in fact, Jefferson sent a ship for him, is the truth of the matter. And but truthfully, there were other problems too. Paine himself did not feel safe sailing back to the United States prior to that because there was a price on his head. Any English ship that would have picked him up, he'd end up on a gallows.
And didn't Jefferson write to Paine saying that you will find us worthy of sentiments of former times?
Yes, that we have returned to sentiments worthy of former times. Correct. That was Jefferson's statement, yes.
I don't want to let the program end without a historical note here that might be very pertinent today. Oftentimes when a person is active and certainly controversial, the contemporaries are not as kind as future historians. So, and that can encourage people today who, I heard some people talking today about having the courage of your convictions. Tell us, Jeffrey, I'll let you do this, that when he died, it was really a sad story that even though you're sitting here with this national organization honoring him at his death, he was not honored, was he?
Slowly his friends began to pass and also to abandon him. And he lived his later years and his last few years in New York City, passed away in Greenwich Village, and then was taken to be buried on his farm in New Rochelle, New York, which was maybe 30 to 40 miles away. And in attendance was 5 people, Quaker minister, 2 slaves, and Mrs. Bonneville, and probably one of her children. So it's a paradoxical ending for the man who turned the world upside down and inside out during his lifetime.
On that note, we have to bring the program to the conclusion. That's a very sober note on which to end, but also a very significant historical note that I've always believed in the theory that if one is not a student of history, Robert, as you are, you're a great historian, that one is subject to repeating it. So on that note, let us end. And gentlemen, thank you. On behalf of Steve Schenck and our staff, we thank you for 2 really interesting weeks. And I commend you for all your research and your study that one should do on all subjects, and certainly I know you are very dedicated to that. Ladies and gentlemen, with this interview, we end a 2-week series on the life and writings of Thomas Paine, and we shall move to yet another subject next week. I hope you'll join us at that time. We have a great enjoyment in bringing you this program and trying to exchange ideas. That is what democracy is all about. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
Recorded on the campus of North Idaho College, Public Forum is the longest-running entirely college-produced program on PBS. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us again at this same time next week for another edition of Public Forum on this public television station.